Hi everyone, I'm Jo and I'm a product manager at Atlassian. And I'm here today to help you understand how to set the right metrics to help you build better apps for your users. So as creators of apps, metrics are an important part of understanding if we're headed in the right direction and if we're making the right decisions to make our businesses and our users successful. So today, we're going to be looking at how we at Atlassian measure user success, and then some key takeaways that you can use in your own teams. So just a disclaimer here at the start, I'm going to be running through some real internal examples today, but all of the specific numerical targets that you see will have been changed slightly so that I can share them with you. So let's start off with a quick story. Now at Atlassian, one of our most popular products is Confluence. And last year, to make sure that more users around the world could help their teams create, organize, and collaborate, we wanted to focus on localization. And our first step towards this were translations. So we decided to translate the product into 10 different languages, starting with the most popular ones, depending on where our users were located and usage around the world. So we set our goal, and we measured this by delivering 10 different languages to our customers by the end of 2018. Sounds okay, right? Well, it kind of was. We successfully delivered 10 languages before the end of the year, and we were happy with our progress. We couldn't wait to get feedback from our customers about how much they loved it. But unfortunately, that didn't really happen. NPS didn't increase, and neither did evaluations or conversions. Instead, our customers were angry with us. Instead of being excited by all of the translations that we introduced, they were upset, like this customer here. So it seems that Atlassian used Google Translate to translate Confluence from English to Icelandic. This is such an ugly and bad translation that it hurts to look at it. If it wasn't Google Translate, then fire the guy who claimed he knew Icelandic. So luckily, we didn't actually fire anyone, but we did end up receiving a lot of negative feedback from other customer channels as well. And it turns out that the translations that we introduced were not as accurate as they needed to be and had actually added friction to our product experience. So we set our goal, and we had a way to measure it. We then hit that goal, and we successfully shipped this feature out to our customers. So what went wrong? Well, the mistake that we made was that we were measuring ourselves by output and not by outcome. The goal that we set and the way that we were measuring ourselves was output-driven. Deliver 10 languages in Confluence by the end of 2018. And what we should have been measuring is user success, or outcome. An example of which is to increase user satisfaction by 20% with our non-English speaking customers by the end of 2018. So this metric is outcome-driven because it shows us whether our customers are being successful in achieving their goals. Before, we were making product decisions based on output instead of solving the big customer problems for our non-English speaking users. We didn't take user success into account, and it had a negative impact on our customers. So I promise there's a happy ending to this story, but first, let's walk through exactly what we did to get there. So we're going to start with the 2 questions to ask to ensure that you're measuring the right thing. We'll then walk through the goals, signals, and metrics framework to help you answer those 2 questions. And then finally, I'll share some learnings that we've had along the way with our own personal experiences at Atlassian. So let's start with measuring the right thing. So how do you actually go about setting the right metric? Unfortunately, a lot of the time, when we go to sit down and set our success metrics, we already have a particular feature in mind that we want to focus on. So for example, we think about how shipping this new feature, say a search experience, is going to impact active users, our retention, our conversion, our revenue. And from here, it can be easy for us to fall into the trap of crafting our metric to measure what determines the success of that particular feature. So we look at what feature success looks like. Now, this is a common pitfall, as we can often lose the forest for the trees by focusing solely on optimizing for this feature level metric. So just because our feature is hitting its success metrics, it doesn't always mean that the underlying customer problem that we were building the feature for in the first place is being solved. So instead of starting with feature success, take a step back and really step into your user's shoes. What are their problems? What is it that they want solved? What does user success look like? And then it's simply up to you and your team to figure out how you're going to measure that. So how do we actually go about doing this? So one way is to use a framework that helps you start by putting the user at the start of everything that you do. And the framework that I want to run through today is the Goals, Signals, and Metrics framework. So the Goals, Signals, and Metrics framework is a top-down approach to measuring metrics that matter. It allows you to define what user success looks like through defining your goals, and then finding ways to measure that through identifying your signals and your metrics. So we've been using this at Atlassian to help us measure the success of the work that we're doing. So let's dig into these a little bit deeper. So there are 3 elements to this framework. First, your goals are your desired result. It's what defines success for your user. Now, placing user goal setting as your first step forces you to be top-down, and it's critical for setting the right metric. So for example, if I were to set a goal for this talk here, it would be to give a useful talk at Alice Camp to the attendees. Now, your signals are then your predictors of the associated goals. And they'll represent the behavior that you want from your users once the feature is shipped. And they tell you whether or not you're on the right track. So a signal for this talk would be that I see the audience smiling and nodding as I go. There's a couple, thank you. And finally, your metrics or your measures will assess your success against these signals and your goals. So for this talk, my success metric would be to get a 4.5 or higher session approval rating, and that's how I'd measure if my talk was useful or not. So if we go back to the story from the beginning, the team was measuring success through this one output-driven goal. And over time, we realized that our investment wasn't actually solving customer pain. So we decided to turn things around, and we implemented the Goals, Signals, and Metrics framework to set the right metrics with user success in mind. So again, we started with defining what user success looks like. And to do this, we ran the Goals, Signals, and Metrics play, where we gathered the whole team into a room for about 2 hours. Now for this play, all you need are some Post-its, some Sharpies, a whiteboard, and some markers. And that's going to help you run through 3 rounds of brainstorming. So 1 round for your goals, 1 for your signals, and 1 for your metrics. So the first round is going to help you set your goals. To do this, first spend 5 minutes in silence to individually come up with as many user goals as you can. The idea here is to write 1 goal per Post-it, and it may seem a little bit strange, but in this step, you're actually aiming for quantity over quality. That sounds a little bit weird, but we're aiming for volume here. There are no bad ideas at this point. When your 5 minutes are up, you then go around the room and share your ideas on a whiteboard. If you see any natural groupings form, post those near each other and summarize key themes. Then comes the hard part. So it's up to you and your team to discuss and settle on the top 1 to 2 user goals that you want to focus on. So there are going to be a lot of good ideas, and it's going to be really hard to narrow them down. But instead of trying to achieve a little of every single goal, it's much more impactful to focus on achieving a lot of a few goals. So you're probably going to end up with something that looks like this, It's a whiteboard with lots of post-it notes everywhere with groupings and summaries written out. This is an example from another project that we were running recently. Unfortunately, it's a little bit blurred out because it's not shipped yet, but you get the idea. So for us, we landed on one goal, and that was to ensure that non-English speaking teams can collaborate and get work done with Confluence. We then looked at our signals. So these are the predictors of your associated goals. They're the behaviors that you see from your users, and they tell you whether you're not being successful. Again, to get to your signals, run through that same process you did for each goal. 5 minutes individually, focusing on as many signals as you can, sharing and grouping, followed by discussion and summary. Again, make sure that you choose just 1 to 2 top signals for each goal so that you can set focus for your team. So we had 2 different signals that we wanted to look at holistically to get a better idea of what success looks like for this goal. So first, if we were on the right track, we would see that our users who were working with a non-English language used our translations. And this would help us learn whether our users were actually opting in and using the features that we were building. Second, users don't revert back to English. So if we nail this experience, the customers that are working with a non-English language and opted into using our translations would not revert back to English. And this would be a good indicator of whether or not we were being successful in our goal to ensure that non-English speaking teams can collaborate and get work done with Confluence. So looking at these, we were then able to set the right metrics to measure. So again, metrics are measurable and they define what success looks like. Again, for your metrics, look at each goal and signal and run through that process one last time. For your metrics, make sure you reserve a little more time for discussion, as you want to make sure that your team is completely aligned on each success metric that you set. For us, we had 2 metrics. First, the ratio of users in the same language as their web browser is greater than 30%. And this would show us whether users working with a non-English language used our translations. And then second, 50% of users that switch to a translation don't revert to English within 6 months. So this would show us whether users revert back to English after having used one of our translations. So these metrics go together and they give us the right view of what success looks like for our users. Now here you may be thinking, signals and metrics look very similar. How are they different and why is it important to distinguish between them? Well, the key difference here between the signal that you set and your metric is that your signal gives you an idea of whether or not you're on the right track to hitting your metric and being successful. But the metric shows you whether or not you have been successful. So in a nutshell, your signals are your leading indicators. They help you see whether or not you're on the right track. And your metrics are usually lagging indicators. And they help you determine the longer-term success of your feature or your app. So going back to our talk example, a leading signal is that the audience is smiling and nodding. And that's something I can tell right now in the short term. And a lagging metric is to get to a 4.5 or higher session approval rating. And this is something that I can't determine until after the talk. So it's important to distinguish between these two, because the changes that you make and the improvements that you introduce don't just have short-term, but longer-term ramifications on your users and your business. So it's crucial to understand if you're on the right track and whether or not you need to pivot your strategy to help you get there. So before going through this process, our feature-driven goal was to deliver 10 languages in Confluence by the end of 2018. And then after we put user success first, our user-driven goal was all about ensuring that our non-English speaking customers can collaborate and get work done with Confluence. So with this, we then started asking the right questions, we had a clear focus, and we were working in the right direction to solve problems for our non-English speaking customers. So this helped us focus on improving the quality of our translations in Confluence, and it led to happier international customers that could get work done in Confluence in their own language. This process is something that you can take and run for any feature or app in your own teams, and it will help you set user-focused goals. So now that we've actually seen how to use the goal signals and metrics to set metrics that optimize for user success, does that mean we're done? Are we finished today? Unfortunately not. In reality, it's often not a one-step process, and it can take your team a few iterations to get to the right metric. So to do this, you can again use the goal signals and metrics framework to continuously sense check and refine your success metrics as you go. So we're now going to run through another example from a different project that iterated on the goal signals and metrics to find their right metric. The example that I want to share with you today is focused on a problem that our team worked on for the past year, and that's setting success metrics for Jira email notifications. So our team went through 3 different iterations to land at the current set of success metrics that we use to measure success on whether or not we're solving for the problems that our users are facing right now with Jira email notifications. And I want to take you on our journey, starting with our initial iteration. Now, to do this, we first sat down and we explored our user problem. Simply put, users were receiving far too many irrelevant notifications from Jira. From this, we defined our goal as simply users are notified for things that they care about. So how do we actually know if a user has cared about a notification that they've received? Well, the signal that we determined to measure this was that users are opening their emails. And our success metric was a 20% increase in users clicking through to product links from an email. So in the first couple of weeks after defining these metrics, it seemed like we had a good measure of success. We had started with our user goal and then flowed through to set our metric. In reality, when we went out and we dug deeper into user behavior, we quickly discovered that users simply clicking through from an email wasn't actually a great measure of users caring for that notification. So this was because for Jira users, we found that there were actually 2 different types of notifications: informative notifications and actionable ones. So informative notifications are emails that are useful to users by simply delivering information. For example, a notification informing you that an issue was transitioned to done by someone on your team. Now, as a product manager, this email is useful to me as it tells me when the team is moving forward and I have a rough idea of how much of my sprint is getting done. But I only needed to read this notification and not actually click through to the issue to have found it useful. Actionable notifications are emails that are valuable to users by helping them to drive action. So for example, a notification telling you that you were mentioned on a comment. Now here, we can still infer that the user found that email to be useful if they click through to the product to reply to the comment or like it. So for informative notifications, we expanded our success metric as the email being opened. And for actionable notifications, we kept it defined as the email being clicked through to. So in our first iteration, by focusing solely on click-through rate, we weren't optimizing for that first bucket of informative notifications at all. Come on. There we go. So with this, we went back to our goals, our signals, and our metrics, and we ended up splitting our signal into 2, from users simply opening their notifications to users opening their informative notifications and users clicking through from their actionable notifications. Our metric also evolved from a 20% increase in user click-through as an indicator of success to an increase in users opening informative emails, and an increase in users clicking through from an actionable email to measure success. So we kept these metrics for a while before we found that, yet again, there was a better metric for measuring the success of actionable emails than just click-throughs. So if we go back and we consider our definition of actionable notifications, that is, emails that are valuable to our users by helping them to drive action, and we look at some examples like being mentioned on an issue or having an issue shared with you, we found that there was actually a more granular level of measuring users valuing these types of emails than just click-throughs. And we called this the action rate. So the idea of an action rate is to follow the journey of a user from the notification itself, back into the product, and then through to that user completing a successful action. For example, a user being shared an issue and then opening it and then assigning it to themselves is a much better indicator of that user caring for that notification than just click through. So we defined our action rate as a user receiving an email about an issue and then either commenting, liking, transitioning, editing, or reading it. And we measured reading with a proxy of at least 30 seconds spent dwelling on the issue. So again, we went back to our second goal signals and our metrics, and we iterated on our success metric for actionable notifications from click-through rate to action rate. So this example was very specific to that new email feature in Jira, but it can be extrapolated for lots of other features. So for example, determining that users are opening your apps or actioning your features may have similar metrics. So you can see how because we started with defining user success first, we could continuously refine our metric to ensure that we were optimizing for the right thing. As you can see, setting successful metrics isn't an easy feat for any app or feature, but it can be a really important tool in our toolbox in order to make sure that we're building the right things for our users. Now, while using this framework, there were some really interesting lessons that I learned, more often than not the hard way, and I want to share some of them with you today so that you can keep them in mind when you're measuring your own metrics. So first, metrics can sometimes come in pairs, and there are certain situations where you need to consider what your counter metrics are. So your counter metrics are your metrics that you don't want to optimize at the expense of. A simple example on our team is we have a metric to reduce the number of Jira emails that we send out. However, we don't want to do this at the expense of hindering user engagement. So reduce the number of emails that we send while balancing a 0% decrease in Jira monthly active users. For us, these two metrics go hand in hand. Second, avoid writing the pesky X% as a placeholder target. So most of the time, you're going to be able to use your past data to understand a baseline for your feature and then set a good target. But there are certain times, for example, when you're measuring new features or even new apps, where you are not going to be able to determine what a good target to set is. And here it can be really tempting to just write, we're going to hit X% as a target. Now, instead of this, I recommend that you use your intuition to set a tangible target based on the information that you do have, even if that means that you're going to be making one or two assumptions. Without a real target, it can be really hard for your team to make concrete decisions, and even an estimated target is better than none. So if it still seems daunting to pick a number just out of thin air, you can think about it in terms of failure. That is, for the investment that you're thinking of putting in, what's the minimum target that you'd be disappointed in reaching? So using our countermetrics example, our team determined that for the amount of effort that we were putting in, we would be disappointed with not achieving at least a 20% reduction. In fact, all of the targets that I just went through for the notifications example were defined using this way. And although we weren't 100% sure that these were the right targets at first, it was still really helpful for our team to have a goal to reach for and then iterate from. Now moving on to our third learning, be specific. That is, make sure that you're being clear with what you're setting out to achieve. So let's use our example of increasing email open rates by 20%. So this was a great metric. We had started with the user and we had iterated multiple times to get to it. But wait, is that 20% increase in relative or absolute terms? And what time frame are we talking? This quarter or the end of the year? So these distinctions can cause misalignment within your teams if they're not made clear. So a relative difference is a ratio and an absolute difference is an addition or subtraction. So for example, if our open rates today are 20% and we want to increase it by a further 20%, this could mean either going from 20 to 24% in relative terms or going from 20 to 40% in absolute terms. So if I was thinking that we were trying to get to 40% and the rest of the team were thinking that we were trying to get to 24%, that'd be a huge difference to be misaligned on. So make sure that you're being specific. Next, make sure that you pair your quantitative metrics with qualitative analysis. So your quantitative metrics are only going to tell you that something has happened, and only through qualitative analysis will you be able to understand why it's happening. So in our notifications example from before, our quantitative metric told us that users weren't opening some of their emails. And only through qualitative analysis, that is actually just going out and talking to our users, did we understand why it was happening, which it turns out there were two types of notifications, informative and actionable, and there were different user behaviors associated with each one. Finally, make sure that you balance actual product execution against setting the perfect metric. It can be really easy to rabbit hole and spend too much time into finding your perfect metric and setting your perfect target. Instead, iterate and course correct as you go to make sure that you're shipping the right customer value as quickly as you can. So to summarize, start by determining user success. Measuring the right thing means asking two questions. What does user success look like? And then how can we measure that? To answer these questions, use a framework like the goals, signals, and metrics that will force you to start with the user. So if you want any further information on the framework that I went through today, you can access it here through this link. It will have more instructions on how to run that play that I ran through earlier, and some good guidelines on what makes a good or bad metric. Third, writing down X% as a placeholder target might be tempting, but challenge your team to put down a number to get the discussion going and learn from. And once you do put down a target, make sure that you're being specific with what you're trying to achieve. And finally, understand that choosing your metrics is going to be an iterative process, and make sure that you balance your execution and learning with setting the perfect metric. So I hope that you can use these learnings and our stories to get to a culture of setting top-down metrics in your own teams that keeps your user at the core of everything that you build. Thank you.